Good afternoon, everybody. Are y'all ready for a little bit of Louisiana story time? Because tonight we're going to be talking about Madame Lalaurie and her house of horrors. Marie Delphine McCarty was a New Orleans socialite born in March of 1787. She was one of 5 children of Irish immigrants. She was very well known. Her family was very well known. Her uncle was governor of the Spanish American provinces and Florida from like 1785 to 1791. One of her cousins was the mayor of New Orleans in the early 1800s. So she lived through the Haitian Revolution of 1791. Slaveholders at this time were like super anxious about slaves revolting. So this widespread fear of these slaves revolting led to a lot of slaveholders mistreating their slaves more than normal. I mean, obviously they already did, but because they feared an insurrection. To put into perspective these times, she was married first when she was 13 years old. He died. And she was married again when she was 21. They had 4 children and he died in 1816. And then she also had 1 child from the previous marriage. In 1825, she would marry a physician in New Orleans. And in 1832, they built a mansion on Royal Street in New Orleans, complete with attached slave quarters. She maintained a high position in the New Orleans socialite circle, and she lived in this mansion with her husband and 2 of their daughters. In November of 1832, it seemed that she petitioned for separation from the doctor, but it does not seem that that actually happened because in 1834, we'll get back to that, he was still there. So they buy this property. It's like a 3-story mansion. They have all these fancy parties. They're like social butterflies in New Orleans. People said she treated her slaves like well. She treated them well in public or in the public eye, or that she treated them fairly. But there were some rumors that behind closed doors, she did not treat them fairly, which led to, at some point, some lawyers being sent over to her to remind her of slave ownership rules of the minimum requirements for treatment of slaves. They found no evidence of wrongdoing, but it was rumored that one actually threw himself to his own death because of the treatment that she gave them. And another one jumped from the roof to avoid being beaten. So there were a bunch of slave deaths on this property, and they were buried there. There were reports of her starving and chaining these slaves up. So like at one point, they actually searched her house, and she was charged with cruelty to her slaves, and she had to free 9 slaves. But like family members bought the slaves and gave them back to her. On April 10th of 1834 is when all hell would break loose. Delphine and her husband Louis had a party. A fire broke out at this party, and they didn't even end the party. They just moved it to the courtyard. It's believed at this time that a cook there intentionally started this fire, and when the firefighters came, she told them to go upstairs. The firefighters actually used ladders to climb up to further investigate. They pulled the drapes, and what they saw, trigger warning, y'all. This is bad. Bad. Okay, before they find all this, they found that particular cook who started the fire intentionally had chained herself. Oh, no, she was chained to the stove. She didn't chain herself to the stove. And she did that to end her own life because she was just done with it. She told the firefighters, if I go to the top floor, I'm never coming back. So Delphine wouldn't let them open the doors on the 3rd floor. So they literally had to like climb through windows and bust the doors down. All right, y'all. I'm going to try to say this like as classy as, is that a word? As gentle as I can. There were operating tables on the 3rd floor. Some of these slaves were hanging from their limbs. Some of their eyes and mouths have been sewn shut. They had been mutilated, and some of them, their body parts had been rearranged and like sewn on in like these experimental surgeries with no anesthesia. Some had their bones broken and reset, and they actually had one person who, like, this is hard to even talk about, y'all. Like, they had reset all their bones to make them like a human spider. Some had holes drilled into their brains, which were stirred with a wooden spoon. Some were alive, begging to have their life ended. So word starts to circulate as the firemen are discovering this. Madame Lalaurie and Louis have jumped on a carriage and ran and got on a boat. So a mob forms outside thinking that Madame Lalaurie and Louis are still there. And before the police even arrived, only the walls were left. This mob had burnt the entire place down. And then the mob had brought these bodies out to be viewed on the streets to show people what Madame Lalaurie and Louis did. Some believe she was torturing them because in her brain, she remembered her mother being unalived by a slave when she was a child. And that, like, it affected her so much. But, y'all, this is just, like, sadistic. There's no... So as far as anybody knows, Madame Lalaurie and Louis fled and they ended up in Paris. They got on a boat. They went all the way overseas, which is probably a best bet for them. It is rumored that Louis possibly died on a hog hunt. And it's also rumored that Delphine may have returned to the United States, to New Orleans, but nobody's sure about that. There's a gravestone in New Orleans that says that Madame Lalaurie died in Paris in 1842, but Paris has records that she died in 1849. We don't really know. Like, during the reconstruction of this property, crews found bones under the floors and the walls, like, everywhere. Like, what they saw when they actually found all these victims was nothing compared to what had happened before they got there. And by 1888, this property had been completely reconstructed. It has been turned into many things over the years, including a school, a juvenile delinquent home, a bar, a furniture store, and even apartments at one time. In 2007, Nicolas Cage actually bought it for $3.5 million. For some reason in 2009, maybe he just let it happen, it was foreclosed on. So there used to be tours, but let me tell you, there ain't no more. I think it's pretty ridiculous that they would have tours there. Like, this is morbid, and it's just like the saddest thing I've ever heard in my life. And I would not want to be in that energy ever at all. It is safe to say that paranormal groups who have had permission to be there have like experienced every single thing that you could possibly paranormally experience. When they did have tours, tour guides claimed that they could see a little girl jump off the roof, which was reportedly one of the slaves. They had voices of agony, chains rattling. One window has been plastered over symbolically, the window that the firemen actually climbed up into. Anyway, this is just a big... It's so freaking sad, y'all. And so if you're ever in New Orleans, you can drive past 1140 Royal Street. You can't go in, but you can drive past there if you feel like it. I've been past there myself. But, like, I feel for the souls of that place. Like, it's just... It was insane. And that is the story of Madame Lalaurie.